Ruth Morrison's neighbors laughed themselves hoarse when the widow spent her last savings building a massive barn frame completely around her tiny cabin in 1876, calling it Morrison's Folly, until the worst Wyoming blizzard in memory left her the only one with a dry home. While every other roof in the valley leaked, collapsed, or blew away, Ruth's protected cabin stayed warm and intact inside its timber shell, saving 19 neighbors who fled their failing homes for her foolish double structure. Drop your location below and hit subscribe for more incredible frontier survival stories. The funeral for James Morrison on September 15, 1875, left Ruth alone on their Wyoming homestead with a leaking roof and winter approaching fast. As neighbors offered condolences, water dripped steadily into buckets placed throughout the cabin, a constant reminder of problems James had planned to fix before the logging accident took him. Ruth stood in her sodden home, watching sympathy turn to calculation in neighbors' eyes as they assessed how long a widow could last alone on Prime Valley land. The roof situation was catastrophic. James had patched and repatched the cedar shingles every spring, but Wyoming winters were brutal on roofing. Ice dams formed, causing water to back up under shingles. Fierce winds lifted edges, allowing driven snow beneath. The constant freeze-thaw cycle split even good wood. Now, water stains marked every wall, and Ruth knew another winter would likely see complete failure. The quotes for roof replacement consumed her entire savings with no guarantee the new roof would last longer. "You should sell to us and move to town," Thomas Garrett advised, eyeing the valuable water rights. "A woman alone can't maintain a homestead. That roof will collapse by Christmas, mark my words." Ruth's jaw tightened. At 38, she was stronger than most men assumed and cleverer than they'd ever suspect. "I'll find a solution," she replied firmly. The traditional solution, replacing shingles, treated symptoms, not the cause. Wyoming weather destroyed roofs because they faced nature's assault directly. As Ruth studied her failing shelter, a radical thought emerged. What if the roof never had to face weather at all? What if she could protect the entire cabin like valuable equipment stored in a barn? Standing in her dripping main room, Ruth sketched possibilities. A second roof built over the first seemed redundant, but a complete protective structure around the cabin that could solve multiple problems. It would shield the roof completely, create additional storage space, provide wind protection, and make repairs accessible year-round. The idea seemed audacious, perhaps impossible for a widow alone, but conventional solutions had already failed. Her grandfather in Norway had built protective structures around valuable things. Ships in dry dock got temporary buildings. Hay received elaborate protection. Why did homes, their most valuable possession, face weather directly? The more Ruth considered, the more sense her unconventional solution made. She had timber rights from James's work, basic carpentry skills, and desperation driving innovation. By October, Ruth had drawn detailed plans. A post and beam structure would rise around her cabin, creating a building within a building. The engineering would be simple but massive. Everyone would mock her. But as water continued dripping into buckets and winter approached, Ruth made her choice. She'd build protection around her protection, creating something the frontier had never seen. The widow's dilemma would be solved not by conventional repair, but by revolutionary design. October 1875 found Ruth Morrison at the sawmill, presenting plans that made even experienced timbermen pause. She needed posts 20 feet tall, beams capable of spanning 30 feet, and enough lumber to frame a structure 4 times her cabin size. The mill owner, Eric Swanson, studied her detailed drawings with growing bewilderment. This wasn't a barn for animals or hay. It was a protective shell designed to encompass her entire home. "Mrs. Morrison," Swanson said carefully, "this structure could house 6 cabins. The cost in timber alone—" "I have James's timber rights," Ruth interrupted. 40 acres of standing pine he never harvested. I'll trade half for milling the other half to my specifications. The design reflected weeks of careful planning. The outer structure would stand independently, not touching the cabin except where necessary. Posts would be set in stone foundations, preventing rot and frost heaving. The frame would rise 16 feet above the cabin peak, allowing air circulation while preventing snow accumulation. Most critically, the barn roof would extend far beyond the cabin walls, ensuring no weather could reach the vulnerable, original structure. Ruth's engineering borrowed from bridge building and barn construction, but adapted for unique purposes. Cross-bracing would handle Wyoming's fierce winds. The roof pitch, steeper than typical barns, would shed snow before dangerous accumulation. Large doors on opposite ends would allow wagon access, turning the protected space into year-round workshop and storage. Ventilation gaps near the peak would prevent moisture buildup while maintaining protection. Swanson's skepticism softened as he recognized the design's brilliance. "This could work," he admitted, "but raising these timbers, you'll need a crew. No woman can—" "I'll use block and tackle," Ruth explained, showing mechanical drawings. "The same principles that let one man load massive logs. I've calculated the pulley arrangements. What one strong back can't lift, proper mechanics can." The timber rights trade was generous. Swanson knew it. But Ruth understood frontier economics. Cash was scarce, but resources could be bartered. James's unharvested trees would rot standing. Better to trade half for the ability to use the rest. The mill would profit, and she'd get her materials. Win-win negotiations that necessity taught better than any school. Word spread quickly about the widow's peculiar project. Martha Brennan visited, finding Ruth surrounded by scale models built from kindling. "Ruth, dear, this is madness. Why not just fix your roof properly?" Ruth pointed to water stains spreading across her ceiling despite recent patches. "Because properly means doing the same thing repeatedly while expecting different results. I'm done fighting symptoms. This frame will eliminate the problem entirely." By November, cut timbers began arriving, posts that required 3 men to unload, beams that seemed impossibly massive for one woman's project. Ruth organized everything methodically, marking each piece according to her plans. Neighbors gathered to watch, some offering condescending advice, others taking bets on when she'd abandon the impossible project. But Ruth had committed her resources and reputation. The barn frame would rise, or she'd lose everything trying. November 1875 brought early blizzards that tested Ruth Morrison's resolve before her protective frame even began rising. As snow accumulated on her failing roof, creating ominous creaking sounds, she worked frantically to establish foundations for the massive posts that would support her barn frame. Each foundation required a hole 4 feet deep below the frost line, filled with carefully selected stones. 24 such foundations in frozen ground, with winter storms already arriving. Ruth developed techniques born from necessity. She built fires over each foundation location, maintaining them overnight to thaw frozen earth. By dawn, she could dig several feet before hitting frozen ground again. The process was exhausting. Tend fires, dig, haul stones, mix mortar that wouldn't freeze, set posts perfectly plumb. Her hands cracked and bled. Her back screamed protest. But each completed foundation brought her closer to protection. The first major storm struck while she had only 6 posts set. Winds exceeding 50 miles per hour tested her partially complete structure. Ruth watched anxiously as the tall posts swayed but held, their deep foundations and cross-bracing performing exactly as designed. Meanwhile, her cabin roof lost another dozen shingles, and water poured through expanding gaps. The race between construction and catastrophe had become deadly serious. Thomas Garrett arrived during a brief calm between storms, finding Ruth mixing mortar in sub-zero temperatures. "This is insanity," he declared. "You'll kill yourself trying to build this monstrosity. Sell now, while you still can." Ruth's response came through action, not words. Using her pulley system, she raised a massive corner post alone, a feat that should have required 4 men. The mechanical advantage she'd calculated worked perfectly. Garrett watched in stunned silence as the widow positioned and secured timber he couldn't have budged. "My husband died," Ruth said quietly, "but he didn't take my mind or determination with him." The work attracted unexpected help. Young Benjamin Turner, considered simple by the community, appeared daily to assist. He couldn't read Ruth's plans, but possessed intuitive understanding of balance and leverage. Together, they developed rhythms, Ruth directing, Benjamin providing strength where mechanics weren't enough. She paid him in hot meals and respect, rare currencies for someone usually mocked. By December's first week, all 24 posts stood vertical, their tops awaiting beams. The skeleton structure already changed wind patterns around the cabin, reducing drafts. Snow accumulated between posts rather than on the roof. Ruth's exhaustion was bone deep, but she'd proven the impossible possible. A widow and a simple boy had erected framework that construction crews would respect. Inside her still-leaking cabin, Ruth studied the next phase plans. Beams weighing hundreds of pounds needed to span between posts 20 feet overhead. Traditional construction used many men or cranes. She had neither. But she had pulleys, patience, and growing confidence. The foundation storms had tested her resolve and methods. Both had held. The frame would rise beam by beam through whatever winter delivered. December 1875 dawned clear and windless, rare conditions Ruth Morrison couldn't waste. The massive beams lying frozen to the ground needed to rise 20 feet into position before the next storm arrived. Her pulley system, refined through weeks of post-raising, faced its greatest test. Each beam weighed over 300 pounds and measured 30 feet long. Construction crews would use 6 men minimum. Ruth had herself and Benjamin Turner. The engineering solution came from ship-rigging principles Ruth remembered from childhood books. Multiple pulleys created mechanical advantage that multiplied force exponentially. She'd mounted blocks at strategic points on the posts, running heavy rope through systems that turned 300 pounds into manageable 50-pound pulls. The beams would rise slowly but inevitably, physics defeating brute force requirements. The first beam took 4 hours to position. Ruth and Benjamin worked in careful coordination. She directed angles while he provided steady pulling power. The beam rose inch by inch, swaying slightly but controlled by guide ropes. When it finally settled into its notched positions atop opposing posts, both workers collapsed in exhausted triumph. 1 beam placed, 23 to go. Martha Brennan arrived with hot soup, finding Ruth and Benjamin preparing the second beam. "I've come to apologize," she said quietly. "I thought you were foolish, but watching you work, you're doing what none of us imagined possible." "Necessity is a harsh teacher," Ruth replied, accepting the soup gratefully. "When conventional solutions fail, you find unconventional ones or perish." Word of the morning's success spread rapidly. By afternoon, unexpected volunteers appeared. Not the landowners who wanted Ruth to fail, but their sons, young men impressed by ingenuity and determination. They didn't take over, but followed Ruth's direction, learning her pulley systems and careful methods. The second beam rose in 2 hours, the third in 90 minutes as the system refined. The human architecture proved as important as the wooden one. Ruth assigned roles based on observation, who had steady hands for guide ropes, who could maintain consistent pulling rhythm, who possessed the spatial intelligence to spot problems before they became dangerous. She taught through demonstration and trust, creating a crew from individuals who'd never worked together. By sunset, 6 beams spanned between posts, creating the skeleton of something magnificent. The volunteers stood in awe of their day's work. They'd participated in frontier engineering that defied conventional wisdom. More importantly, they'd learned that impossibility often meant nobody had tried the right approach yet. Young Thomas Garrett, defying his father's wishes, lingered after others left. "Mrs. Morrison, I want to learn more. Your methods, they're like nothing I've seen." Ruth smiled, exhaustion temporarily forgotten. "Come tomorrow. We'll need all the help we can get before the next storm." That night, despite her leaking roof and aching body, Ruth felt hope. The beams against the evening sky promised protection that would last generations. The widow working alone had become a leader, teaching innovation. The barn frame would rise not just through her determination, but through community transformation. One beam, one volunteer, one impossibility defeated at a time. January 1876 brought the most challenging phase of Ruth Morrison's barn frame project, constructing a massive roof over her existing cabin roof. While her original shingles continued failing catastrophically, she orchestrated the rise of protective rafters that would shield her home permanently. The engineering challenge would have daunted professional builders, but Ruth's systematic approach and growing volunteer crew had developed methods that made the impossible merely difficult. The rafter design reflected careful planning for Wyoming's extreme weather. Each rafter consisted of doubled 2x10s, creating strength exceeding traditional barn construction. The pitch, steeper than normal at 1212, would shed snow before dangerous accumulation. Most innovatively, Ruth designed the rafters to attach with adjustable connections, allowing for wood movement and settling without stressing joints. Her grandfather's Norwegian wisdom echoed, "Build for the wood to breathe, and it will serve generations." Young Thomas Garrett had become Ruth's most dedicated assistant, defying his father's fury to work daily on the project. He'd absorbed her mechanical principles and now suggested improvements. "If we pre-assemble rafter sections on the ground," he proposed, "we can raise completed triangles rather than individual pieces." Ruth's eyes lit up. "Brilliant. We'll need temporary supports, but yes, much safer and faster." The volunteer crew had evolved into an efficient team. Benjamin Turner's intuitive understanding of balance made him invaluable for positioning. The Olson brothers contributed precise joinery skills. Even skeptics' wives began providing meals, drawn by the communal energy surrounding the audacious project. The barn frame had become the valley's focus, transforming from mockery to marvel. The first rafter assembly rose on a calm January morning. Using synchronized pulling on multiple rope systems, the crew raised a completed 20-foot triangle into position. Ruth guided the operation from atop the frame, her commands clear and confident. When the rafters locked into place, spontaneous cheering erupted. The skeleton of protection was becoming reality. Inside the barn frame, but beneath open rafters, Ruth's cabin experienced immediate benefits. Wind no longer struck directly. Snow accumulated on the outer structure rather than the cabin roof. The constant dripping slowed, then stopped in protected areas. The double roof concept was proving itself even before completion. Thomas's father arrived during a particularly complex rafter raising, intending to drag his son home. He found Thomas expertly managing guide ropes, while Ruth directed operations from above. The sight of his son's competence and the structure's impressive progress silenced his prepared tirade. He watched the entire assembly rise and lock into place through coordinated effort his construction experience couldn't match. "How?" was all he managed. Ruth climbed down, facing her chief critic directly. "By refusing to accept that traditional methods are the only methods. Your son has brilliant engineering instincts. You should be proud." By month's end, the entire rafter system stood complete, awaiting sheathing. The barn frame skeleton created cathedral-like space around the humble cabin. More importantly, it had created community from conflict, proving that innovation could transform both structures and societies. March 5, 1876, brought the storm locals would call the Great Destroyer for generations. Weather observers in Cheyenne recorded unprecedented conditions, winds exceeding 90 miles per hour, snow falling at 6 inches per hour, temperatures dropping 40 degrees in 3 hours. Across Wyoming territory, roofs collapsed, walls caved in, and families fled failing shelters. Ruth Morrison watched from inside her barn frame as nature tested every joint, beam, and principle of her audacious construction. The barn frame's response to the storm's assault proved magnificent. Wind that would have torn traditional roofs apart dispersed harmlessly across the massive structure's surfaces. Snow accumulated on the outer roof, while the cabin beneath remained completely protected. The steep pitch Ruth had insisted upon shed accumulations before dangerous weight built up. Most remarkably, the temperature inside the protected zone stayed 20 degrees warmer than outside, creating a microclimate that defied the storm's fury. Inside her cabin, Ruth experienced something unprecedented: complete dryness during a major storm. No drips, no leaks, no snow infiltration. The constant anxiety of weather damage had vanished. She maintained a small fire for warmth, but the protected space required far less heating than exposed cabins. While neighbors fought desperately against nature's invasion, Ruth calmly prepared soup and bread for refugees she expected would arrive. They came in waves as the storm intensified. First the Brennans, their roof partially collapsed. Then the Olson family, their walls breached by wind-driven snow. By midnight, 19 people sheltered within Ruth's barn frame, their damaged homes abandoned to the storm. The protected space around the cabin provided room for all, with the inner cabin offering warmth while the outer structure provided safety from elements that killed exposed travelers in minutes. Thomas Garrett arrived supporting his father, whose own properly built home had failed catastrophically. The older man's pride had frozen along with his extremities. He looked at Ruth with newfound respect, seeing not the foolish widow he'd mocked, but the engineering visionary who'd solved problems he hadn't even recognized. "I was wrong," he said simply, words that cost him dearly, but purchased redemption. The storm raged for 3 days. Inside the barn frame, a community formed from necessity. Ruth organized sleeping areas, cooking rotations, and entertainment for frightened children. The protected space became a small village, proving that her design offered more than weather protection. It created gathering space that traditional cabins couldn't provide. Stories were shared, conflicts resolved, and bonds formed that would reshape valley relationships. When the storm finally exhausted itself, the survivors emerged to devastation. 12 homes had suffered major damage. 3 had collapsed entirely, but Ruth Morrison's cabin sat untouched within its protective frame. Not a shingle displaced, not a drop of water infiltrated. The Morrisons' folly had become Morrison's triumph. As neighbors departed to assess damage and begin rebuilding, many asked Ruth for design plans. The widow who'd built a barn around her cabin had revolutionized frontier construction philosophy. The aftermath of the Great Destroyer storm marked a turning point for the entire valley community. As families rebuilt their damaged homes throughout March 1876, they incorporated lessons learned from sheltering in Ruth Morrison's barn frame. The widow who'd been mocked for unconventional thinking became the most consulted person in the territory on protective construction. Her kitchen table, still sitting in the cabin that had stayed perfectly dry, became an informal engineering school. Thomas Garrett, now fully estranged from his disapproving father, worked with Ruth to document the barn frame principles in detailed drawings. His drafting skills, combined with her practical experience, created plans that could be adapted to different situations. Some families couldn't afford complete barn frames, but they could build protective extensions over vulnerable sections. Others modified the concept, creating partial shells that shielded prevailing wind sides. The Olson brothers pioneered the first adaptation, building what they called a weather porch, essentially a mini barn frame protecting their cabin's entrance and north wall. The cost was a quarter of Ruth's full structure, but provided 60% of the protection. This pragmatic modification spread quickly among families with limited resources. Ruth freely shared her pulley techniques, making construction possible for small crews. Benjamin Turner, once dismissed as simple, had become a sought-after construction assistant. His intuitive understanding of structural balance, developed through months working with Ruth, made him invaluable for complex lifts. Ruth ensured he was fairly paid, establishing his worth in a community that had previously seen only his limitations. The barn frame project had revealed abilities that traditional society overlooked. Martha Brennan organized the Valley's women to support construction efforts, recognizing that protective structures benefited entire families. The barn frame brigades provided meals for work crews, watched children while mothers helped build, and maintained detailed records of what worked and what didn't. The social structure Ruth had accidentally created during the storm became formalized into cooperative building efforts. By April, 7 new protective structures rose across the valley. None matched Ruth's original in scale, but each incorporated core principles: independent support, steep pitch for snow shedding, ventilation without exposure, and community cooperation in construction. The valley that had operated on isolated family units now functioned as an interconnected building collective. Knowledge flowed freely because Ruth had established that precedent. The transformation extended beyond construction. The shared storm experience inside Ruth's barn frame had broken down social barriers. The Garrett patriarch, humbled by his home's failure and Ruth's success, publicly apologized for his opposition and contributed lumber to other families' protective structures. Former rivals collaborated on building projects. The physical shelter Ruth created had fostered social shelter, protection through community rather than isolation. Ruth herself continued innovating, adding features to her barn frame based on winter observations. She installed sliding panels that could open entire walls during summer, transforming the space into covered outdoor living area. She added rainwater collection systems to the massive roof. Most importantly, she documented everything, creating a manual that would influence frontier construction for decades. June 1876 brought unexpected benefits from Ruth Morrison's barn frame, as the structure designed for winter protection proved equally valuable during Wyoming's blazing summers. The massive roof created shade that kept her cabin 20 degrees cooler than exposed homes. The open sides allowed continuous breeze flow while blocking direct sun. Most remarkably, the protected space became the valley's first year-round outdoor workshop, revolutionizing productivity during months when traditional work ceased due to heat. Ruth discovered she could process preserves, dry meat, and perform countless tasks in comfort while neighbors sweltered in stifling cabins or risked sunstroke working outside. The barn frame's posts, originally seen as obstacles, became perfect mounting points for pulleys, tools, and work surfaces. She installed roll-up canvas walls that could partition spaces for different activities, canning in one section, woodworking in another, all protected from sun and sudden summer storms. The community gathering function, discovered during winter crisis, evolved into planned utility. Ruth hosted workshop days, where families brought projects requiring space and tools. Women quilted in groups, while children played safely in shade. Men collaborated on furniture building and equipment repair. The barn frame became the valley's first community center, though nobody called it that yet. The structure meant for protection had created congregation. Thomas Garrett, whose engineering skills had flourished under Ruth's mentorship, proposed ambitious summer modifications. "What if we install louvers along the roof peak?" he suggested. "Hot air rises. We could create convection that pulls cool air from ground level." Ruth's eyes lit up with possibilities. Together they designed adjustable ventilation that turned the barn frame into a giant chimney, creating airflow that made the space comfortable even during 100-degree days. The modification cost little, but transformed functionality dramatically. Other barn frame builders quickly adopted the innovation. The economic impact became undeniable. Ruth's preserved goods, produced efficiently in her protected workspace, commanded premium prices. Her furniture, built year-round rather than seasonally, showed superior craftsmanship from consistent working conditions. The widow who'd spent her last resources on Folly now earned more than many established ranchers. Success bred emulation, as others recognized protective structures enabled year-round productivity. Benjamin Turner established his own business within Ruth's barn frame, repairing equipment for valley farmers. His careful work, protected from weather extremes, gained reputation for reliability. Ruth charged him no rent but took payment in maintenance help, establishing a symbiotic relationship that benefited both. The simple man dismissed by society had become an essential craftsman, his abilities revealed through opportunity. By summer's end, the barn frame's versatility had converted all remaining skeptics. Valley meetings moved naturally to Ruth's protected space. Harvest preparation happened efficiently in shade. Social events flourished in the evening coolness. The structure designed to prevent roof leaks had become the heart of valley life. Ruth Morrison hadn't just solved her winter problems, she'd created a new model for frontier community architecture that addressed all seasons. By autumn 1876, economic analysis of Ruth Morrison's barn frame revealed staggering returns on her desperate investment. The Territorial Bank, initially dismissive of lending to a widow for experimental construction, now studied her model as frontier development example. Bank President Harold Richardson visited personally, documenting costs versus benefits in detail that would influence lending policies throughout Wyoming territory. The initial investment had totaled $320 in materials and traded timber rights. Ruth's entire inheritance and future security gambled on innovation. Traditional roof replacement would have cost $80 with no guarantee of lasting success. But the barn frame's benefits multiplied beyond simple weather protection. Richardson calculated saved repair costs, increased productivity from year-round workspace, income from community usage, and health benefits from consistent shelter conditions. Mrs. Morrison's return on investment exceeds 200% in the first year alone, Richardson reported to his board. More significantly, the structure appreciates rather than depreciates. While traditional cabins require constant maintenance against weather damage, her protected building improves with age as the community value increases. Ruth maintained careful records, sharing them freely with interested builders. Her ledgers showed dramatic fuel savings. The protected cabin required half the heating of exposed homes. Medical expenses dropped to near zero as consistent temperatures prevented the respiratory ailments plaguing frontier families. Food preservation success eliminated costly spoilage. The economics extended beyond money to life-quality measurements that banks were just beginning to recognize. The community workshop function generated unexpected income streams. Ruth charged modest fees for tool usage and workspace rental, creating Wyoming's first makerspace decades before the term existed. Families paid pennies to use her lumber mill setup, saving dollars versus commercial alternatives. The barn frame had become a business incubator, launching enterprises that couldn't exist without protected workspace. Thomas Garrett, inspired by Ruth's example, proposed a joint venture, manufacturing pre-cut barn frame kits for sale throughout the territory. His drafting skills combined with Ruth's practical knowledge could create standardized plans adaptable to various cabin sizes. Ruth agreed, but with conditions reflecting her values. Basic plans would remain free for those who couldn't afford kits. Profits would fund a tool library accessible to all builders. The ripple effects transformed valley economics. Property values increased for homes with protective structures. The territorial assessor noted that barn frame properties showed appreciation, while traditional buildings depreciated. Insurance companies, studying storm damage patterns, offered reduced rates for protected structures. Ruth's innovation had created economic advantages that compounded annually. Market Day relocated naturally to Ruth's barn frame, the protected space allowing year-round commerce. Vendors paid small fees that funded community improvements. The widow who'd faced poverty now managed the valley's economic hub. Her ledgers showed community wealth increasing as protective structures enabled consistent productivity regardless of weather. By year's end, 3 territorial newspapers had featured Ruth's story, spreading economic awareness beyond the valley. Letters arrived requesting plans, offering to buy kits, proposing partnerships. The barn frame had evolved from desperate shelter solution to economic development model. Ruth Morrison hadn't just saved her roof, she'd created an innovation economy that would transform frontier communities throughout the West. Winter 1877 found Ruth Morrison in an unexpected role, professor of practical engineering, to audiences that included territorial officials, railroad engineers, and university professors. The widow who'd never attended formal school had created innovations that challenged academic assumptions about structural design. Her barn frame had become a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand how necessity-driven innovation surpassed conventional engineering. Professor Wilhelm Steinberg from the Colorado School of Mines arrived in January with a delegation of students. They expected to find lucky accident or crude overbuilding. Instead, they discovered sophisticated engineering that anticipated principles their textbooks were just beginning to formalize. Ruth's load distributions, wind force calculations done intuitively, and thermal dynamics of protected spaces matched or exceeded academic models. Show them the stress points, Ruth instructed Thomas Garrett, who had become her teaching assistant. Together they demonstrated how the barn frame's flexibility prevented the rigid failure plaguing traditional structures. Joints designed to move slightly under load, posts set to work with frost heaving rather than against it, and roof lines that turned destructive forces into structural advantages. The students took copious notes as Ruth explained through demonstration rather than theory. She loaded snow onto different roof sections, showing how steep pitch and surface texture affected accumulation. She created wind models using smoke, revealing how the barn frame created protective vortexes that traditional buildings couldn't achieve. Most impressively, she showed temperature and humidity readings collected over 2 years, data that research institutions envied. Ruth's teaching method reflected frontier pragmatism. Books tell you what should work, she explained. Weather shows you what does work. When they disagree, believe the weather. This philosophy resonated with students frustrated by theoretical approaches that failed practical application. They learned to observe first, theorize second, revolutionary in academic contexts, but essential for survival. The territorial government sent building inspectors to study Ruth's methods for possible code adoption. They found structures that exceeded every safety standard while using less material than traditional construction. The barn frame principle, protecting the protector, offered solutions to frontier building challenges that claimed lives annually. Officials left with recommendations that would reshape territorial building policies. Railroad companies showed particular interest. Their station buildings suffered catastrophic weather damage, disrupting service and stranding passengers. Ruth's protective structure concept could shelter entire depot complexes, maintaining operations regardless of conditions. The Wyoming Railroad Commission contracted her as consultant, the first woman in such a role. Her innovations, born from a leaking roof, would influence transportation infrastructure across the West. Local teaching proved most satisfying. Ruth established monthly workshops where Valley residents learned construction techniques hands-on. Benjamin Turner had become a master instructor for lifting procedures. The Olson brothers taught joinery methods. Even Thomas Garrett's father, his pride transformed to advocacy, demonstrated foundation preparations. The barn frame had created a teaching community where everyone contributed expertise. By spring, Ruth had written, with Thomas's help transcribing, the first comprehensive guide to protective structure construction. The barn frame method, protection through innovation, would become the frontier's most requested building manual. But Ruth insisted on local publication and affordable pricing. Knowledge that saved lives shouldn't be restricted by cost or distance. By 1878, the Morrison method had spread across the Western Territories like seeds on prairie wind. From Montana mining camps to Texas ranches, protective structures based on Ruth's barn frame principles sheltered families who'd learned that conventional building meant constant battle with nature. The widow's innovation had become a movement, transforming not just individual homes, but entire communities' approach to frontier living. The railroad accelerated adoption as tracks reached remote settlements. Ruth's consultation work with Wyoming Railroad had produced standardized depot designs incorporating barn frame protection. Passengers waiting in comfort during blizzards spread stories of the revolutionary structures. Station masters reported dramatic maintenance savings and operational reliability. The protected depots became community gathering points, extending Ruth's vision of shelter as social space. Commercial applications exceeded all expectations. General stores built barn frames to protect inventory and create year-round shopping areas. Blacksmiths discovered protected workspace meant consistent income regardless of weather. Hotels advertised Morrison protected accommodations, charging premium rates for guaranteed comfort. The economic advantages Ruth had demonstrated in her valley multiplied across the frontier. Sarah Mitchell, Ruth's longtime friend, established the Barn Frame Building Society, a women's organization teaching construction techniques to other widows and single women. The society challenged gender assumptions about building capability while spreading practical knowledge. Their motto, "Protection through Innovation," appeared on detailed construction guides distributed free to those in need. Ruth served as honorary president, ensuring the organization maintained community benefit over profit. Indigenous communities showed particular interest, recognizing parallels to their traditional structures that worked with nature rather than against it. A delegation of Shoshone builders visited Ruth, sharing their generational knowledge while learning her frame-raising techniques. This cultural exchange enriched both traditions, creating hybrid designs suited to specific regional challenges. Ruth's openness to learning from others exemplified the innovation mindset she promoted. International attention arrived through immigration channels. Norwegian settlers recognized sophisticated evolution of their traditional building methods. German engineers wrote requesting technical specifications. Canadian Pacific Railway sent delegations to study protected station designs. The barn frame concept translated across cultures because it addressed universal needs: shelter, community, and economic sustainability. Young architects from Eastern universities began arriving, their theoretical training challenged by Ruth's practical success. Many stayed to work with Thomas Garrett, who had established a design firm specializing in protective structures. His drafting skills, combined with field experience, bridged academic and practical knowledge. The boy who defied his father to help a widow now led architectural innovation from his barn frame office. Government recognition culminated in the Territorial Engineering Award presented to Ruth in November 1878. The first woman recipient stood before officials and industry leaders, her work clothes replaced by a simple dress, her hand still bearing construction calluses. Her acceptance speech was characteristically direct. Necessity taught what comfort couldn't. When traditional methods fail, innovation isn't optional, it's survival. May we always remember that the best solutions often come from those with the most to lose. The movement Ruth started showed no signs of slowing. Each protected structure built created advocates who spread the concept further. The barn frame had evolved from desperate widow's solution to frontier transformation. March 15, 1880, brought a storm that would test every barn frame structure across Wyoming territory, a 3-day blizzard that meteorologists would later call the storm of the century. Winds reached 120 miles per hour. Snow fell at rates that defied measurement. Temperatures plummeted to minus 60 degrees. This apocalyptic weather event would provide ultimate validation of Ruth Morrison's innovation as barn frames across the territory faced conditions that destroyed conventional buildings wholesale. Ruth, now 52, watched from her original barn frame as the storm struck with unprecedented fury. The structure that had weathered 4 years of Wyoming winters faced forces beyond anything she'd designed for. The massive timbers groaned and flexed, but held. Snow accumulated on the outer roof in enormous quantities before sliding off in controlled avalanches. The protected cabin inside remained dry, warm, and stable, while the world outside turned deadly. Across the valley, the test repeated at every barn frame structure. The Olson brothers' weather porch modification proved remarkably effective, protecting their vulnerable north wall completely. Thomas Garrett's own home, built incorporating every lesson learned from Ruth, rode out the storm like a ship in heavy seas, moving slightly but maintaining integrity. Even partial implementations showed dramatic advantages over traditional construction. The railroad depots built to Ruth's specifications became life-saving refuges. Hundreds of travelers and locals sheltered in protected station spaces while the storm raged. Telegraph reports confirmed similar successes across the territory. Not a single Morrison method structure had failed catastrophically. Minor damage occurred, but the protective principle held universally. Complete protection beat partial exposure every time. Traditional buildings fared catastrophically. The territorial capital later documented over 2,000 structures destroyed, 500 lives lost, and millions in damage. Entire towns simply vanished beneath crushing snow, families frozen in homes that couldn't maintain heat. Roofs didn't just leak, they disappeared entirely, torn away by winds that barn frames had dispersed harmlessly. Inside Ruth's barn frame, 37 people weathered the storm, including territorial officials who'd been visiting for a building standards meeting. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Bureaucrats discussing construction codes sheltered in the structure that had redefined those codes. Governor Thompson himself helped tend fires and organize supplies, experiencing firsthand what community shelter meant versus individual survival. When the storm finally exhausted itself, the landscape had transformed beyond recognition. But everywhere barn frames stood, life had continued almost normally. Children had played in protected spaces. Work had proceeded in sheltered workshops. Communities had gathered instead of cowering separately. The structures had protected more than buildings. They'd preserved civilization itself against nature's worst assault. The aftermath brought vindication beyond Ruth's imagination. Insurance companies made barn frame construction mandatory for coverage. Banks required protective structures for mortgage approval. The territorial legislature passed the Morrison Building Standards Act, making basic protective construction legally required in exposed areas. The widow's desperation had become law. Ruth stood in her barn frame, now weathered but solid after 5 years, watching neighbors emerge from protection she'd pioneered. The storm of the century had provided final proof that innovation born from necessity could transform how humanity sheltered itself against nature's extremes. By 1882, a new generation had grown up considering barn frames as natural as the cabins they protected. Ruth Morrison, now 54, watched with satisfaction as young builders improved upon her original designs. Thomas Garrett had married and built his family home incorporating innovations that amazed even Ruth. Collapsible wall sections for seasonal adjustment, integrated rainwater systems, and modular expansions that allowed growing families to add protected space incrementally. Children who'd sheltered in Ruth's barn frame during the Great Destroyer storm were now adults building their own protective structures. Emma Olson, who'd been 6 during that first crisis, designed a barn frame with integrated greenhouse sections, creating year-round food production in Wyoming's harsh climate. Her modifications showed how each generation adapted core principles to new challenges. Evolution, Ruth actively encouraged. Benjamin Turner's transformation symbolized the social changes barn frames had catalyzed. The simple man who'd helped Ruth raise her first posts now ran the territory's most successful construction company, specializing in protective structures. His intuitive understanding of balance and stress, recognized and nurtured by Ruth, had flourished into expertise that university-trained engineers respected. He employed and trained others dismissed by society, creating opportunity from innovation. Ruth established the Morrison Building Institute in her original barn frame, teaching construction principles to anyone willing to learn. The classroom occupied the same protected space where desperate families had first sheltered. Transformation from crisis shelter to educational center, marking societal evolution. Students included women, minorities, and others traditionally excluded from building trades. Ruth's only admission requirement was willingness to share knowledge freely. The curriculum went beyond construction techniques. Ruth taught observation methods, how to read wind patterns, understand snow loads, recognize structural stress before failure. She emphasized innovation mindset over rote learning. Every site is different, she instructed. Don't copy, adapt. The principle matters more than the plan. This philosophy created builders who could solve unique challenges rather than merely replicate designs. Young architects from Yale and Harvard arrived skeptically but left transformed. Ruth's practical demonstrations exposed gaps in their theoretical education. She showed how academic load calculations failed to account for real-world variables like ice formation patterns or wind-driven snow's adhesive properties. Many extended their stays, trading manual labor for invaluable field education. Several would later revolutionize architectural education by incorporating Ruth's experiential teaching methods. The Institute's influence spread through its graduates. Each certified Morrison Method builder signed a pledge to teach others freely, creating an exponential spread of knowledge. By year's end, Ruth estimated over 1,000 builders across the territories understood barn frame principles. The movement had become self-sustaining, no longer dependent on one woman's efforts, but carried forward by communities that understood protection through innovation. Sarah Mitchell's daughter Rebecca, studying engineering at a women's college in Massachusetts, wrote her thesis on the Morrison Method, How Frontier Innovation Challenges Architectural Assumptions. The academic recognition pleased Ruth less than Rebecca's plans to return and establish protective structures for reservation schools. The next generation understood that innovation meant responsibility to community. Professor Ernst Zimmermann from Berlin's Technical University arrived in summer 1883 with a team of international engineers to study what European journals called the Morrison phenomenon. The widow's intuitive engineering had achieved results that challenged established architectural principles. Zimmermann's team brought the latest measuring equipment to quantify what Ruth had understood through observation, how barn frames created microclimates that defied conventional thermodynamics. The scientific analysis revealed stunning sophistication in Ruth's original design. The structure's orientation, which she'd chosen based on prevailing wind observation, created vortex patterns that dispersed destructive forces while maintaining beneficial air circulation. The roof pitch, selected through trial and error, matched mathematical ideals for snow shedding. Every intuitive decision aligned with complex engineering principles Ruth had never studied formally. Temperature monitoring throughout seasonal cycles showed the barn frame created what Zimmermann termed thermal momentum. The protected space moderated temperature swings so effectively that daily variations inside measured less than 5 degrees, while outside temperatures swung 40 degrees. This stability, achieved without mechanical systems, surpassed modern building performance. Ruth's achievement preceded passive solar design principles by decades. The social dynamics within barn frames fascinated the team's anthropologist. Communities with widespread adoption showed measurably different social structures, more cooperation, less hierarchy, and stronger support networks. The shared construction experience and communal shelter during crises had created bonds that persisted through generations. Physical architecture had shaped social architecture in ways urban planners were just beginning to understand. Ruth participated actively in the studies, correcting academic assumptions with practical experience. When Zimmerman's calculations suggested certain joints should fail under observed loads, Ruth demonstrated how wood movement and seasonal variations created strength through flexibility rather than rigidity. "Your numbers assume materials fight forces," she explained. "My buildings dance with them." This philosophical difference revolutionized how engineers approached frontier construction. The team documented innovations beyond the original barn frame. Valley builders had created sliding roof sections for summer ventilation, integrated water collection systems that prevented ice damming, and modular designs allowing easy expansion. Each adaptation showed organic evolution of principles rather than rigid adherence to plans. The Morrison method wasn't blueprint, but philosophy, protection through innovation, community through construction. Zimmerman's published findings created international sensation. Engineering schools worldwide requested copies of his documentation. The Royal Institute of British Architects invited Ruth to lecture, an honor she declined, suggesting Thomas Garrett represent the work instead. She understood her role as catalyst rather than celebrity. The validation mattered less than continued innovation by those she'd inspired. The scientific endorsement triggered government action. The Department of Interior commissioned barn frame construction for remote outposts. Military engineers adapted designs for harsh climate installations. The innovation born from a leaking roof influenced federal building policy. Yet Ruth insisted basic designs remain public domain. "Knowledge that saves lives belongs to everyone," she stated when patent lawyers approached. By study's end, Zimmerman declared Ruth's barn frame the most significant vernacular architecture innovation of the century. The widow who'd never attended school had schooled the academics, proving that necessity remained innovation's greatest teacher. April 18, 1886, brought catastrophe that transformed Ruth Morrison's barn frame concept from regional innovation to national necessity. The Great San Francisco earthquake, followed by devastating fires, left hundreds of thousands homeless. Traditional relief efforts struggled with temporary shelter that provided little protection or dignity. News of Wyoming's barn frame communities reached disaster coordinators desperate for better solutions. Ruth, now 58, found herself consulting with federal relief officials who initially struggled to believe a frontier widow had solved problems stumping professional engineers. But testimonials from territorial governors, railroad executives, and international academics overcame skepticism. Within weeks, Ruth and a team of Morrison method builders traveled to California, bringing protective structure expertise to urban disaster zones. The adaptation required significant innovation. Urban lots couldn't accommodate full barn frames around existing structures. Instead, Ruth developed disaster frames, quickly erected protective shells that could shelter multiple families while providing privacy and dignity absent from tent cities. Using salvaged materials and simple joinery, teams could erect basic protection in hours rather than days. The structures provided immediate shelter while enabling permanent reconstruction within. Thomas Garrett coordinated material logistics, his organizational skills proving as valuable as his engineering knowledge. Benjamin Turner trained construction crews, his patient teaching methods enabling rapid skill transfer. Sarah Mitchell mobilized women's organizations to manage shelter assignments and community formation within protective structures. The Valley team that had learned through crisis now taught others facing catastrophe. The psychological impact matched physical benefits. Families sheltered in barn frames showed markedly better recovery outcomes than those in traditional relief tents. The protected common spaces fostered community support. Children played safely while parents worked on reconstruction. Evening gatherings in sheltered areas maintained social bonds despite displacement. The structures provided not just shelter, but framework for resilience. Ruth's innovations during disaster response included collapsible frame sections for easy transport, universal joints allowing irregular salvage materials, and rapid assembly techniques enabling community participation. Most importantly, she taught observation skills, how to identify stable anchor points in damaged areas, assess materials for emergency use, and adapt designs to available resources. Disaster response required flexibility her philosophy naturally provided. Military engineers documented every innovation, recognizing applications beyond civilian disasters. The Navy adopted modified barn frames for temporary bases. The Army Corps of Engineers incorporated protective structure principles into disaster response protocols. Ruth's frontier innovation influenced national preparedness strategies. The woman who'd protected her cabin from weather now protected entire communities from catastrophe. By operation's end, over 2,000 disaster frames sheltered earthquake survivors. More significantly, local builders had learned construction techniques they'd continue using. The Morrison method had proven adaptable from rural homesteads to urban disasters. Ruth returned to Wyoming exhausted but satisfied. Her innovation, born from personal necessity, had become public resource. The California success triggered national adoption. Cities in hurricane zones requested barn frame plans. Tornado-prone communities built protective structures as community shelters. The disaster frame concept evolved into America's first standardized emergency shelter system. Ruth Morrison's leaking roof had led to innovations that would save thousands of lives in future disasters. By 1890, Ruth Morrison's barn frame innovation had evolved from desperate experiment to established architectural movement influencing building practices worldwide. At 62, Ruth could have rested on her achievements, but she remained focused on ensuring the knowledge spread to those who needed it most. The Morrison Building Institute had graduated over 500 certified builders, each committed to teaching others freely, creating exponential growth in protective construction expertise. The territorial government established the Morrison Award for Innovation, recognizing frontier solutions to practical problems. Ruth served as first judge, selecting recipients based on community benefit rather than technical complexity. Winners included a teenage girl who designed collapsible frames for seasonal shepherds, a Chinese immigrant whose bamboo adaptations enabled rapid disaster response, and a former slave whose protective structures for freedmen communities combined African building traditions with barn frame principles. Economic analysis showed staggering cumulative impact. Territories with widespread barn frame adoption reported 40% reduction in weather-related property damage, 60% decrease in winter mortality, and tripled productivity from year-round protected workspaces. Insurance companies now offered Morrison rates for protected structures. Banks considered barn frames as collateral enhancement. The widow's innovation had reshaped frontier economics fundamentally. Thomas Garrett, Ruth's first student, had become internationally recognized architect specializing in climate adaptation. His firm designed protective structures for locations from Alaskan military posts to Mexican agricultural stations. Yet, he maintained Ruth's philosophy of accessible innovation. Basic plans remained free. Complex commercial projects subsidized community buildings. Knowledge flowed both directions. Field innovations informed new designs. Benjamin Turner's construction company had grown to territorial prominence while maintaining its mission of employing society's overlooked members. Former prisoners, disabled veterans, and aged-out orphans found skilled trades training and fair wages, building protective structures. Benjamin's patient teaching methods, learned from Ruth, transformed lives while constructing buildings. Social architecture remained inseparable from physical construction. International influence accelerated through immigration networks. Norwegian communities recognized sophisticated evolution of traditional techniques. Mexican builders adapted adobe construction to incorporate protective frames. Chinese railroad workers applied principles to temporary camps, improving living conditions dramatically. Each cultural adaptation enriched the Morrison method while maintaining core principles of observation, innovation, and community benefit. Ruth's health began limiting her physical involvement, but her intellectual contributions intensified. She dictated comprehensive building guides that Sarah Mitchell's organization published in multiple languages. She established scholarship funds for women and minorities entering building trades. Most importantly, she created the Morrison Archive, detailed documentation of every innovation, failure, and adaptation encountered over 15 years. The archive's dedication ceremony drew hundreds to the original barn frame. Territorial governors, railroad executives, international academics, and countless families whose lives had been saved by protective structures gathered in the space where innovation began. Ruth spoke briefly but powerfully. This archive preserves not my work, but our work. Every adaptation, every improvement, every life saved through shelter, that's the legacy. May future builders find inspiration and practical guidance within these records. As she cut the ribbon, snow began falling on the massive protective roof that had started everything. Inside, warm and dry, the community celebrated not just a building, but a philosophy, protection through innovation, freely shared, continuously improved. February 2, 1893, brought Ruth Morrison's final great test as the Devil's Blizzard descended upon Wyoming with fury surpassing even the storm of the century. At 65, Ruth no longer built structures herself, but remained the spiritual center of the barn frame movement. As winds reached 130 miles per hour and temperatures plummeted to -70, her original structure would face the ultimate trial while she coordinated valley protection efforts from within its shelter. The storm struck during the day, trapping children in schools, workers in fields, and travelers between destinations. But Wyoming had changed dramatically since Ruth first built her protective frame. Nearly every public building featured Morrison method protection. School barn frames sheltered hundreds of children who would have frozen in traditional structures. Community frames at crossroads provided refuge for caught travelers. The infrastructure Ruth pioneered proved its worth catastrophically. Inside her original barn frame, Ruth directed rescue coordination with calm efficiency. Ham radio operators, protected in their sheltered workspace, maintained communication when telegraph lines failed. Search parties organized using barn frames as tactical bases. The protected spaces she'd created for individual families had evolved into disaster response network that saved lives throughout the storm's 3-day rampage. The storm tested every innovation developed over 17 years. Modular frames flexed but held. Disaster adaptations sheltered refugees. Even partial implementations, weather porches, protected entrances, sheltered walkways, proved life-saving. Most remarkably, not a single complete Morrison method structure failed catastrophically. Minor damage occurred, repairs were needed, but the protective principle held universally against nature's worst assault. Ruth's personal moment came when the original barn frame faced wind gusts exceeding design parameters by 50%. The massive timbers groaned and sang but maintained integrity. Snow loads that crushed traditional buildings elsewhere slid harmlessly from the steep roof. The structure, built by a desperate widow and a simple man, had evolved through community improvement to withstand forces that challenged modern engineering. As the storm waned, reports arrived of minimal casualties compared to previous blizzards. The Devil's Blizzard had killed 12 in Wyoming, tragic but miraculous compared to hundreds in states lacking protective infrastructure. Every death occurred outside barn frame protection. The correlation was absolute. Ruth's innovation had transformed from individual salvation to territorial resilience. The aftermath brought Ruth unexpected recognition. President Cleveland telegraphed personal congratulations. International engineering societies awarded highest honors. But the validation that mattered most came from a young mother who arrived at Ruth's barn frame carrying an infant. "My baby lived because our school had protection," she said simply. "Thank you." Ruth held the child, remembering her own desperation 17 years earlier, understanding that every protected structure sheltered such moments. Standing in her original barn frame, now weathered but solid as the mountain granite, Ruth surveyed a valley transformed. Where isolated cabins once cowered before storms, protected communities thrived regardless of weather. The innovation born from a leaking roof had revolutionized how humans sheltered against nature's extremes. The Devil's Blizzard had provided final proof that desperate innovation, freely shared, could transform survival itself. Ruth Morrison died peacefully on October 10, 1897, at age 69, in the same protected space where she'd sheltered desperate families 21 years earlier. Her final days were spent dictating improvements to barn frame designs, her mind sharp even as her body failed. Thomas Garrett transcribed her last innovation, adjustable foundation systems for permafrost regions, ensuring her final gift to builders facing extreme conditions. The funeral drew thousands to witness the original barn frame. Governors, engineers, and academics stood alongside farmers, widows, and the forgotten people Ruth had always championed. Benjamin Turner, now successful beyond imagination, wept openly as he touched the first post they'd raised together. "She saw what I could be when everyone saw what I couldn't," he said, speaking for countless others Ruth had believed in. The eulogies came from unexpected voices. A Shoshone elder spoke of how Ruth learned from their traditions while teaching her own. A former prostitute testified how barn frame construction work had provided escape from degradation. Children, now adults, shared memories of playing safely in protected spaces while blizzards raged. Each speaker revealed another facet of innovation that transcended mere construction. Ruth's true monument stood across the landscape, thousands of barn frames sheltering families from Alaska to Mexico. The Morrison method had evolved through countless adaptations, but core principles remained: observe carefully, innovate boldly, share freely. Engineering schools taught courses based on her empirical methods. Disaster response protocols incorporated her protective structures. Building codes reflected her safety innovations. The desperate widow had reshaped how humanity sheltered itself. The economic legacy defied calculation. Historians estimated barn frames had saved millions in prevented damage, thousands of lives through protective shelter, and immeasurable productivity through year-round workspaces. But Ruth's impact transcended economics. She'd proven that innovation arose from necessity, that sharing knowledge multiplied benefits, and that community formed through common purpose lasted generations. Modern analysis reveals Ruth's intuitive engineering anticipated principles formalized decades later. Her flexible joints preceded earthquake-resistant design. Her thermal mass utilization matched passive solar calculations. Her community shelter concepts influenced urban planning theory. She achieved through desperation and observation what others derived through education and theory. This humbled professionals while inspiring amateurs. The Morrison Building Institute continues Ruth's mission into the 21st century, adapting barn frame principles to modern challenges. Climate change refugees use updated disaster frames. Urban architects incorporate protective structures into sustainable design. The philosophy, protection through innovation, remains relevant as humanity faces new extremes. Each adaptation honors Ruth's example of transforming crisis into opportunity. Standing today in Ruth's original barn frame, now a national monument, visitors experience the profound simplicity of her solution. Posts and beams that saved a widow's cabin became architecture that saved a civilization's approach to shelter. The roof that never leaked after protection sheltered ideas that continue flowing freely. Ruth Morrison's legacy lives not in timber, though that endures, but in the principle that when traditional methods fail, innovative solutions shared generously can transform survival into thriving. Her barn frame still stands, protecting not just from weather, but from the resignation that accepts preventable suffering.